Kristin Barker, MSW, is a licensed clinical social worker at the Families Learning About Recovery Project, a Category 3 grantee of the NCTSN within Children's Advocacy Services of Greater St. Louis at the University of Missouri-St. Louis. Kristin and her team began implementing the Caring for Children Who Have Experienced Trauma, a workshop for resource parents, as a group therapy intervention for combined groups of caregivers, including birth parents, kinship providers, and foster and adoptive parents. Their specific procedure consists of an individual intake appointment during which potential participants go through screening, have the group process explained, and agree to participate in 16 75-minute group sessions. The use of the RPC in more traditional group therapy sessions is one example of ways that organizations across the country are adapting and using this material to increase child well-being. How the CAC in St. Louis manages group dynamics and screening potential participants while maintaining as much fidelity to the original curriculum as possible is the focus of this podcast.
Thank you. As mentioned, I work at a child advocacy center that provides both forensic and clinical services for children who have experienced trauma. We were receiving both internal and external demand to develop a trauma-informed parenting group that would provide additional support and education about child trauma and its impact. What we realized is that we work with a very diverse population of caregivers and really wanted to develop a group that could meet all of their needs. So we were looking for a group that could provide resource parents with continuing education, that could complement a caregiver's participation in their child's individual trauma treatment, whether that caregiver was a biological parent, relative, or foster parent, or to provide additional support to a family who may have just come in for their child's forensic interview and were looking for support and ways to help deal with the knowledge that their child had experienced a trauma. We were also looking at ways to provide a group that would serve as a non-offending caregiver group. That's often a court requirement for parents that may be seeking to regain custody of their children. So with all of these needs in mind, in 2012 we were lucky enough to receive a grant from the St. Louis Mental Health Board to offer this trauma-informed parenting group in our community. We found and fell in love with the resource parent curriculum, but were concerned about its appropriateness for this mixed group of caregivers since it was developed for resource parents. Our two major concerns included issues related to both the curriculum content as well as the potential impact on the group dynamics. So as far as the content goes, we were primarily concerned just about some of the language. Obviously, the resource parent curriculum uses the term resource parents a lot and it refers to the child welfare system through their different examples, the language on the slides, and the case studies. As far as the group dynamics, we were concerned about the potential impact of bringing all of these diverse types of caregivers together. We were concerned about, on one hand, this just being a situation where caregivers may not feel psychologically safe to share some of the challenges they were experiencing with the kids in their care. On the flip side, we were concerned about some outright antagonism between biological parents and foster parents. We thought specifically if a biological parent had had a bad experience with their own kids in foster care, that may negatively impact the group dynamics, or if we had a group of foster parents that were coming in with some preconceived beliefs or judgments about biological parents that would also add to the tension and basically make it so that the caregivers did not feel safe to share both those the successes of raising kids after a trauma as well as the challenges. We also were concerned about the content being more triggering for biological parents or family members based on their proximity to the child's trauma or due to their own trauma history. What we found in running this group is this often tends to be as big a concern for some of our resource parents as it is for our biological parents. Finally, we were also concerned that we may run into some caregivers who were not appropriate for the group due to their own mental health difficulties or substance abuse, and really wanted to make sure that this group was designed in a way that it could support everybody and be helpful for everyone. So, in order to mitigate these risks, I reviewed a lot of the material from the Learning Center, which I highly recommend. Definitely looking at the facilitators' guidelines, the tips for experienced trainers, and especially at ways to adapt the resource parent curriculum to birth parents. I also consulted with other clinicians that I work with, as well as some of the caregivers that I work with, in order to make sure that this model seemed to be a good fit. We decided to take a two-pronged approach to really assess for and to reduce these potential risks. So in one sense, we did a lot of work on the front end. So before a caregiver participates in our group, we require that they attend about a 1-hour meeting with me. That's more of an intake and assessment, but also an orientation to the group. And so one of the things that we decided was to treat this as more of a therapeutic or clinical group rather than a class. And the reason for this is that we're able to offer caregivers a higher level of confidentiality and protect some of that privacy more than we could if we were calling it a class. So during this initial assessment, we review the, different policies related to confidentiality, where our limits to that are, as well as ways that we work to ensure confidentiality within the group setting. We also provide each caregiver with information about the group. So we discuss who the participants are, talk about how there may be a lot of different caregivers and some of the benefits for that of everyone being able to bring in their own expertise and examples and of being a caregiver. We also talk about all of the different types of traumas that children may have experienced whose caregivers are in our group. And this really serves to normalize that caring for a child after a trauma can be a very difficult experience for the best parents and the most professional resource parents, and that as well as the frequency that children may experience trauma. And so just by bringing about some of these examples, we're able to prepare caregivers for what they may hear within the group context, as well as to assess for anything that may serve as a barrier. We obtain information from the caregiver regarding the child's trauma history, as well as the caregiver's trauma history, if they're willing to provide that information to us. Some of the reasons the caregiver wants to participate in our group. So what particular behaviors or reactions is the child experiencing that may be of concern? What additional caregiving goals may this parent have? And we found that obtaining all of this information prior to the group is very helpful in our facilitators planning examples, thinking through parts of the curriculum that may be more triggering to some caregivers, and being able to be extra conscientious of that during the group. As I mentioned, we also use this to really assess for the caregiver's readiness and ability to participate in the group, and to look for anything that may negatively impact the group dynamics. If we find a caregiver is not ready for this group right now, we may provide referrals to other types of groups or mental health services in the community, or we may work with caregivers to link them to other services or case management services that would help facilitate their progress in groups. So we look at that as either being something prior to their participation in group, or instead of, or in conjunction. During the group, we really look, as I mentioned, at both the content and the group dynamics. So for the content, we really want to maintain as close fidelity to the resource parent curriculum as possible. We picked this curriculum because we love it so much and think it does a great job of providing these education and skills related to child trauma. So we wanted to keep those core components present. Logistically, we did split up some of the modules into 2 sessions so that we run this group over 12 weeks, 75-minute sessions. So we're able to do a total of 15 hours, but breaking it into what we found to be more manageable chunks for caregivers to commit to. We changed all of the resource parent language to the more generic form of caregivers. And we also went through some of the different case studies to reflect different types of caregiving situations. So we might have some of the kids who were temporarily out of their home and then returned to their biological parents' home, or who were placed with a kinship provider, or who went through a trauma with the caregiver and are still in their home. So really looking at trying to design the case studies in a way that all caregivers would find something that really connected with their experience. We found we didn't actually have to edit the case studies too much. We were able to keep them pretty much as is, just with some slight tweaks to who the caregiver is. We also looked at some, specific areas of the curriculum. So specifically in the safety module, we emphasize the need to not only establish safety for a child who might be in a new placement, but also to reestablish safety for a child who may, after the trauma, have those difficulties related to safety. So even if it's within their own home, all of a sudden the neighborhood's not seeming as safe as it used to. Their bedroom might not be as safe. And so really making this a more universal experience for kids after a trauma. During the connections module, we really emphasize that all kids have a team. No kids grow up in a bubble, that they all have many different adults around them, and that some of these may be more formal teams in the cases of kids in children's division care, where they have a structured family support team, but also kids who are not in that type of structured environment will also have a more informal team around them. And so really making that a more universal experience. And then we also changed one of the quotes to reflect a way in which a child may lose connections after disclosing abuse by a family member, that looks at, even though this child is still in the same home, they may have lost the connection to the offending caregiver, to other relatives, to community, and different associations there. Finally, in the self-care module, we did add an example of caregivers who have experienced the same trauma as the child at the same time. And this really came about for many of our caregivers who had been victims of domestic violence that the child had observed or had also experienced some physical abuse during these incidents. And so we wanted to be very thoughtful in all of the different ways that a caregiver or a child's trauma may impact caregivers. As far as the group dynamics, we never ask a caregiver to specifically disclose what type of caregiver they are. Generally, they do an introduction of their name and the age of the child that they're primarily here for. We found that many caregivers do disclose on their own what type of caregiver they are, and that hasn't ever been a problem. We also spend a lot of time normalizing the experience of all caregivers of kids who've experienced a trauma. We'll talk about how kids don't come with a manual, and especially after trauma, some of the very tried and true parenting skills that may have worked in the past or worked with other kids or worked with their own child in the past just no longer seem effective. And that's where every caregiver is coming into our group, recognizing that this trauma has really impacted the child and the family system, and are looking for different ways to support their child. So we really try to praise everyone for attending and wanting to learn more about the impact of trauma in order to be the best caregiver for the children in their care. We also normalize that we all are human and we all make mistakes. And so often talking about how we all do the best we can with what we know at the time. And again, it serves as a great testament to people who are able to say, there might be things that in the past I thought that was the way to discipline or the way to raise my child, and now I'm realizing that wasn't the best and I want to learn some new ways. We also spend a lot of time emphasizing the need for self-care and encouraging that within the group setting. We will refer caregivers to the thermometers at the beginning of the curriculum and really being conscientious of different content that may be triggering. We give caregivers the permission to stand up during the group, to leave the room and get a drink of water or take a break as needed, and have found that this has been just as needed for some of our resource caregivers as our biological ones. So again, a nice way of normalizing this for everyone. We also decided to offer a 30-minute consultation period immediately prior to the group's start time. And we offer this to all caregivers as a chance to discuss some of the material in more depth, and specifically, how does this apply to my child in my care? We found that a lot of our caregivers use this time to discuss content that they may have not felt as comfortable sharing in the larger group setting, or with very specific questions about how to use this information to advocate for their child or to speak with other professionals. We've also used this time to allow caregivers to make up some of the missed content, so it served multiple purposes. So with all of this prep work and these considerations, we still weren't sure how it would go. And what we have found in the last 2 years of providing this curriculum is that it has consistently gone better than we could have hoped for. I personally am continuously surprised by just the level of mutual respect and support provided by the group members. We find that the group really makes some strong connections. I think a great sign of a good group is when at the end caregivers are saying, wait, what do we do next? We want to keep meeting up, or that they're exchanging phone numbers. They're planning to continue to meet after the group's over. And this we see regardless of what type of caregivers they are. We also found that the diversity in the group setting really adds to the content and the discussions related to the curriculum material. So we found biological parents really felt comfortable eliciting information about the foster care system and how it works from our foster parents in the group. They might ask questions like, how is it best that I can communicate with my child's foster parent? What things are appropriate for me to talk about and what things shouldn't I? It helped increase some of the clarity of what the role of a foster or a biological parent is when a child's in children's division custody. Who has the right to make certain decisions and who doesn't? Also, we found foster parents were great at providing specific strategies of how to advocate with a child's caseworker or within a family support team meeting or understanding the court system. And that some of our foster parents may be aware of resources and information in the community that our biological parents weren't as aware of. On the flip side, we find that our foster parents have really been able to develop an increased empathy for the experience and the efforts made by biological parents that are seeking to regain custody of their kids, or seeing really positive examples of biological parents who have supported their child after the trauma. We've seen this really become a corrective experience for many of our caregivers. I can think of one specific example of a parent who was in foster care as a child and talked about that being a really negative experience for her personally, but she became tearful during our group when she was listening to one of the other foster parents discussing ways that they support and continue to have relationships with kids that they've cared for. And she expressed that she now has more hope for her own daughter, who was recently placed in foster care, that she has more hope that her daughter will have a positive experience and that other children will have that positive experience within foster care. We've also had some kinship providers who said, now I am viewing, in this case it was a grandparent, they're saying we're now viewing the parent differently, that while we thought this parent had just done wrong by their child, we now see that they were also a traumatized child who is now an adult, and they worked to bring that caregiver in appropriate ways back into their child's life and bringing them in to be a part of treatment. So those examples just continue to impress me and make me feel that not only are the caregivers in our group learning the basics of trauma education and parenting skills, but also really increasing their knowledge and their empathy and learning so much from one another in addition to the curriculum. So I'd like to end with a couple quotes from caregivers because, let's be honest, they can say it better than I can. So one of the caregivers who completed our group said, "All parents and foster parents need this class for children. Everyone could use the help on how to help children deal with trauma as soon as it happens." Another caregiver stated, "Taking these group sessions gave me a place where I did not feel judged, and I knew that the people around the group truly understood where I was coming from and offered positive support, advice, and experiences we could all use or relate to. It was good to have an outlet for these discussions." It has helped me to see that my son and I were just one of many families that experience trauma. It has given me more assurance that with time, positive support, and patience, things do get better.
This marks the end of this podcast. For more information about the Resource Parent Curriculum, please visit us online at learn.nctsn.org/RPC. Thank you for listening.